Should a woman be able to mutilate a man's dead body in order to fulfill her desire to have a child with his sperm? That's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. Recently, my Facebook friend, Observing Libertarian, drew my attention to a newspaper story he thought deserved a lot more media attention. The story reveals with striking clarity our society's sense of male lives, in this case literally the male body, as having a primarily instrumental value, mattering for what they can provide for women. The story out of southern Queensland in Australia is about a woman, Leith Pattison, whose boyfriend, Tony Dean, died quite suddenly last April 2016 of an unrevealed cause. Within a day, the woman had gone to the Supreme Court to request that her boyfriend's testicles be removed and stored at an IVF facility so that she could use his sperm at some future point to get pregnant. She claimed that she and her boyfriend had wanted to have a child together so that in having his testes removed, she was not only pursuing her own interests but fulfilling a shared dream. Friends of the couple provided sworn affidavits that indeed the couple had spoken about having a child and that they'd been planning to get married. They had met online 6 months prior to Mr. Dean's death. Initially, the dead man's parents made no objection to the request before the court. One can imagine that they were likely stunned by their son's sudden death and weren't even thinking about anything else but that tragic loss. But after the court granted the woman's request, the parents had a change of heart, and a follow-up news story reports that they are going to oppose any attempt by the woman to use their son's sperm. It turns out they had never met this girl before their visit to their son's hospital bed, and they have no relationship with her. So the whole thing is a shock, and one can imagine that the idea of this woman using their son's body probably seems like a desecration. That's where the story ended, and I couldn't find anything more about it. The lawyer for the parents said that it was a fairly unusual case and that he hadn't heard of many like it, which suggests that it actually may be somewhat precedent-setting. If not legally, then perhaps socially, and probably deserving of more discussion by men's rights advocates. At the present time, the law is conflicted on this matter. In general, it does allow women to use their dead partner's sperm for pregnancy, but only where explicit consent has been provided, usually in writing. Now, whether a woman should be able to apply to use her dead partner's sperm without having obtained consent strikes at the heart of the issue of male bodily autonomy and self-determination. What discussion I could find on the matter didn't consider that aspect at all. Not surprisingly, the consideration was focused on the desires of the woman and the fate of the unconceived child. Dr. Rebecca Collins has argued that consent laws tend to be too restrictive. She writes that, quote, presumption against consent in the case of deaths caused by sudden trauma is not justified by the argument that most people would not have consented to posthumous reproduction. She claims, quote, there are at least as good reasons, if not better, for supposing that in many cases consent would have been given, end quote. Well, I'm no ethicist, but this seems wonky reasoning. Surely the issue is not whether in the majority of cases consent would or would not have been given, but that in this case, consent was not given. Now let's consider a different but not unrelated set of arguments where the issue is women's bodily autonomy. We know that the primary argument in favor of non-medically necessary abortion has for decades been that abortion is a question of individual female self-determination. Now here's a quotation taken from an article called Why Abortion is a Feminist Issue on the University of Queensland feminist webpage. It came up on top in an internet search on that subject. The author, Rosie Cupidge, puts it this way. She says, quote, widely available abortion is essential so that women can determine what to do with their own bodies, end quote. She goes on to say that there are many reasons why women may want to have an abortion, but that's not the issue. That's nobody's business. The content of their reasons doesn't matter. It is the woman's right and nobody else's to make decisions about her own body. I think it's fair to say that that argument has been so persuasive that it has often enabled pro-abortion advocates to not only supersede morally powerful arguments about the rights of the unborn child, but even ironically to totally elide the fact that another life is involved at all. Rosie Cupidge, for example, doesn't even bother to argue about why the woman's right to control her body is more important than the child's right to have a life at all. She simply says that, quote, the right to life, she puts that in quotation marks to show she's treating it with skepticism. She says the right to life is thrown around way too often as a reason to deprive women of their capacity to self-determination. This has to stop. So she won't even deal with the issue logically. She simply rules it out of order, claiming that, quote, when abortion is not available, it centers a woman's life on her reproductive system. Her reproductive system then becomes the determinant of her life, end quote. I think Cupidge's argument is representative of the main focus of most pro-abortion arguments, and it seems to me that the framing of the argument in this manner is entirely relevant to the case of Tony Dean, whose testes are now in cold storage, potentially to be harvested by a woman seeking to conceive a child. I couldn't help but think that in one sense, the case is an ironic answer to the feminist position that abortion is about a woman's control over her body in which no man is allowed any say at all. It doesn't matter that the man co-created the child with the woman. It doesn't matter if the man wants to have the child. It doesn't matter even if he promises the woman that he'll take over the entire care and financial burden of the child once the child is born. The feminist insistence is always that he should have no say in the matter at all, and that, to all intents and purposes, the child belongs solely to the mother. Well, here's a case where the significance of the man to the creation of the child is front and center. And suddenly, all the arguments about self-determination, about how a person's reproductive system should not become the sole determinant of their life's value, and about how nobody else should be able to have any say in what that person does with their body, all of a sudden those arguments fade away and we get a lot of hypothetical talk about whether Tony Dean or the majority of men would have consented to posthumous reproduction. The fact is that we don't even know for sure that this man really wanted to have a child. Friends of the couple say he did, but perhaps he was simply going along with an insistent girlfriend, not wanting to have a row in front of their friends. Perhaps he had secret reservations about whether the woman would make a good mother or not. Perhaps he started out enthusiastic, but changed his mind as the relationship progressed. Regardless, he's dead now. And the woman shouldn't be able to decide for him. She shouldn't have any access or control over his reproductive tissue. She shouldn't be able to take his sperm out of his body, and the court should have protected his bodily integrity against her invasive plan. I think this is a frontier for men's advocacy. Men's right to reproductive self-determination even after death. Men have always had fewer reproductive rights than women. They've rarely had any say over the lives of their unborn children. Women have always been able to decide whether the child lives or dies. Men have had some control about whether sex leads to an unborn life or not, but in cases where the woman tricks them into producing a life by poking holes in a condom, for example, men have had no recourse. Until now, though, as far as I know, women have not had the right, without the man's prior consent, to extract sperm from men's dead bodies in order to produce the life that they will then shout and demonstrate about their right to control. And they should not have that control granted to them.